Hey pushers, it's Mr. Naimatsu here. Coming in with your activity three. It is World War One. So talking about the beginnings of World War One. Period seven is a beast of a unit. We're gonna get all the way up into almost the beginning of World War Two, I believe, or even into World War Two. So we're gonna go ahead and take some time here to learn about World War One. This is gonna be a part one. We're gonna really be talking about the causes, the American entrance, and also Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. It's quite short. Our entrance to the war is quite short. I think we're only actually fighting for about 16 months, a little bit over a year. Theoretically, it took us a long time after we declared war of those 16 months just to get our army and navy even over towards Europe for us to mobilize and go to Europe. It took some time as well. So I'll talk about that a little bit more, but our entrance in World War One is quite limited. So also, there's a heavy emphasis, obviously, the American participation, and it is quite limited. So we don't need to understand like the major causes of World War One. A lot of you guys who took AP Euro, may always go back to Archduke Franz Ferdinand and the assassination attempt. We really don't need to understand that complex about World War One. What's nice about this class, at least, is that we just need to focus on the U.S. Part of World War One. So that's what we're going to do today. So we'll get into it. Today, you're going to have four activities. One is about these German U-boats, what we would call submarines today. They created this first technology, and that kind of gives them like an unfair advantage. And they sink a passenger ship from Canada called the Lusitania. We're also talking about the Zimmermann telegram, which was a coded telegram given to Mexico to get them to enter on the side of the Germans against the United States. We'll talk about our entrance, and then Woodrow Wilson. We'll go a little bit into him here, talk a little bit of his background, and also go deep into the 14 points that he had created and kind of give you an idea of what you'll be doing in this activity. So first thing, when you Google cause of World War One, you're going to see a lot of different things. I think it's important that we do kind of talk about it, but remind yourself that this is a European fight. And again, as I said earlier, America comes in at the kind of end of the war. So we don't need to be so detailed about what the causes are. But basically, just a little bit of a heads up, there was Austria and there was between Serbia and Bulgaria. Austria-Hungary supported Bulgaria, and there's a Serbian that comes over and actually assassinates Austria-Hungary Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and it just cascades into this alliance system of wars. So basically, you have the Allies, which is Russia, France, and Britain. Russia will get out of the war in 1917, just as the United States kind of enters the war. So Russia comes out, and the U.S. kind of takes their place as the Allies. And then the Central Powers, not the Axis would be World War II, but the Central Powers are Austria-Hungary, Italy, and Germany. But Germany is going to be taking a lot of the blame for this. The big issue when Russia leaves is now, Germany can really focus on what they call the Western Front, which will be in Britain and France. So if you think of your geography, Germany is over here, and actually Britain and France would be here, and then Britain's over as an island, right? And so Germany could focus all of its attacks on the Western Front. And this basically became a war of attrition, which means a lot of people died, and there wasn't like a lot of movement. People weren't moving the lines of warfare, so to speak, one way or another. And this actually ends in an armistice, a peace agreement. So kind of went through the whole thing, just kind of give you a big picture as we go into the little details of what's going on. So now that you kind of have an overview of World War One, we'll talk about the American entrance. So World War One happens in 1914. It begins in 1914, and for a long time, the United States stays neutral. Listening to George Washington and practicing what we have, which is kind of focusing on our continental United States and maybe the Western Hemisphere here and there, but really focusing on our own growth. As I kind of said earlier, the United States is kind of into its teenager, now moving into its adulthood type of point right now, where it's kind of matured, it has grown up, and it is ready maybe to play with the big boys in this whole world politics game. And we can see that already with our push into creating empires and the Spanish-American War, which was our previous lesson. So the United States at this time is neutral, and suddenly a World War One breaks out, and because of alliance system, basically within weeks, all of Europe has now engaged themselves in war because of these secret alliances and secret treaties, which Woodrow Wilson, the president of the United States, will try to undo in one of his 14 points. So while we're staying neutral, we're just going to be kicking it here. But, we've kind of seen this problem before, and this really happened in the Napoleonic Wars, especially if you guys remind yourself. I believe that's period three, period four, excuse me. But during, Thomas Jefferson's time and Madison's time, Monroe's time, there was the War of 1812 also happened during this time. So there was a consistent warfare happening, if you guys remember, because of revolutionary France and Napoleonic France and England. And they kind of set up these blockades, right, to stop people from trading. Well, that kind of happens this time between England and Germany. So England first sets a blockade up here to stop any goods from going into Germany. And the idea of blockades, once again, is kind of to stop that country from getting food, supplies, or other things that will help that country go. It might affect the civilian population, but the hope is you're affecting the population to stop it from committing war. Well, Germany did the same thing, and they basically declared that all this area around basically Ireland and the United Kingdom as a war area as well. So according to the rules of war, when you designate an area of war, if you come in there, you're basically in a war zone, and no matter what you're doing, whether you are being an enemy combatant or not, you may be targeted. And at this time, remember, this isn't like the quote unquote, and I'm not going to even say that because some of us have been personally devastated by war, but these aren't the clean theoretic wars that we kind of see today. Civilian populations will be targeted, especially in World War II. But civilian populations today are targeted now through economic warfare, right? We try to stop trade from happening in certain countries that we don't agree with to force kind of some hardship on the population to hopefully change their government. So that was the idea that's happening. And during this time, the United States has declared neutrality and says, I want to be able to trade with all of Europe. And it's doing so very carefully, and sometimes against the wishes of the English and the Germans. Now, one thing I want to be clear, and I'll talk about this again and expand upon it later, I'll give you an example from JP Morgan Chase. Our ties to England and France were much stronger, obviously due to our history, as you know, because we've had relationships with them, was much stronger than our relationship with Germany. So from the German perspective, you might say this, yeah, America, you're being neutral, but honestly, 80% of the stuff that you are trading, you're trading with these countries against us. Maybe you're trading 20%. All right. And those were kind of actually the ratios. If you look at the amount of trade that was happening between the Central Powers versus the Allies at this time, America was very much pro-British and pro-French. So, I mean, that can't be done, but they did say that they're neutral, and they did trade with Central Powers as well, to give them supplies as well. So yes, they were both sides, but they were kind of lopsided towards the Allies' effort. So during this time, a ship sails from Canada to the United Kingdom, or to, Britain at this time. And one of these German U-boats, here, I should probably actually show you a German U-boat real quick. So U-boat, I may even have a picture. But yeah, I mean, it's actually just showing a submarine, but these were just German submarines. They were really rudimentary. They're not like what they show here. Yeah, this isn't even a World War II one, right? World War I would even be less complex. So it's a very rudimentary type of submarine, but has torpedoes. And the problem was nobody else had this type of technology at this time. So the Germans kind of had this unfair advantage. And so the Germans have basically surrounded Britain with these U-boats, and some of the ships that are coming in, and they're coming from all over the world. Some are landing safely and be okay, and then some are being told and they're returning, they're scared, and some are not leaving at all, right? Everybody's having different responses, but definitely there was a decrease in trade because obviously a lot of ships were concerned about coming in here and getting destroyed by one of these U-boats. So a passenger ship, a cruise vessel that's taking travelers over to the British, leaves from Canada. And the Germans, it's funny, I didn't know this, but you'll see this in Khan Academy. The Germans actually put an advertisement underneath where you could buy the tickets in Canada to go ahead and do it in the newspaper. And in the newspaper advertisement, they say, I just want to remind you guys are entering a declared war zone, and you may be sunk and shot at sea. And so the Lusitania sails, and as it sails, is shot and sunk by sea. A lot of the history will go into this a little bit more. People believe that there were actually armaments because it's coming from Canada over to the British, and so Canada and Britain obviously are under the Commonwealth. They actually have worked together. That's why the Canadians are part of the whole King and Queen of England thing. And if you notice that Merkel, not Merkel, what's our new prince, right? Our prince and princess actually they came back from England to Canada. So, anyways, they have a tie just like the English have a tie to Australia and New Zealand as well. They're part of the larger what we call Commonwealth. And so this is sunk. There were armaments down here. They talk about in Khan Academy that after this is sunk, the British actually try to keep on destroying more evidence at the bottom of the ocean. So there might have been more armaments than that were actually on there. But it was largely a passenger vehicle. It had a Canadian flag, and so it unfortunately was kind of having it's kind of like showing like a British flag. So it was kind of flying a flag that was not showing that it was, the Germans may have targeted it, but it was targeted as blown up. There were 100 and some odd American passengers that were killed. And so this becomes a rallying cry about neutrality. Now, what happens after this is Germans make a statement saying we'll no longer attack those and we apologize and can come out, and they actually limit those type of targetings anyways. But this kind of sears in the American memory. As I taught in the past, I always thought this was a major event, but Khan Academy talks about how this happens kind of a year before we actually declare war. Also, the Germans kind of changed their tactics after this and kind of apologized slightly for it, even though the Lusitania was entering declared war or waters under warfare. So, anyways, that's a sinking of Lusitania, a somewhat of a cause towards the American entrance of World War I. One other thing that I want to talk about, regarding this is there's a lot of research that talks about J.P. Morgan having an influence as well. And J.P. Morgan, prior to the American entrance, when World War I is happening, obviously France and Great Britain need money. They need money to do all these things. And he's actually giving direct loans from his bank to those countries. And so there's another argument to be said out there. And you know me as an economic historian, I think it's a lot has to do with economics. There's an argument to be said that, J.P. Morgan was kind of putting pressure on the U.S. government to get involved on the side of the English and French to make sure they won so that they could pay back their loans back to J.P. Morgan. So, it is true once again that there were stronger economic times between between Britain and France with the United States than there was between the United States and Germany. So perhaps economic interests were in there, perhaps corporations were in there, industrialists were in there, bankers were in there, and they were also paying pressure on, Woodrow Wilson and the U.S. government to declare and support a war effort on the side of the English and French rather than the Germans. So again, showing this kind of bias towards the Allies' effort. Another thing that happens is there's a coded telegram. There's a cable that goes underneath the Atlantic Ocean that's actually linking worldwide communication. And this telegram's intercepted by the British and decoded. And basically it says, hey, Mexico, it comes from the German Imperial Office, and it goes to a diplomat, a representative in Mexico, and it's trying to encourage Mexico basically to fight on the behalf of the Germans against the Americans. So imagine that the United States would actually have a war on its southern border between Mexico and America, and obviously to kind of distract the Americans from entering the European war. And they kind of promised maybe some of the lands that were lost in the Mexican cession after the Mexican-American War might be granted back if they come in. The Mexicans never really actually take this quite seriously, but nonetheless, this is intercepted by the British, and it's given immediately to the United States, and it's being made public in the United States, and people start seeing that the Germans are actually conspiring against the U.S., and so another reason in which they think we should be going to war. What's interesting is, Woodrow Wilson, just to talk a little bit about the history of Woodrow Wilson, who's the president during World War I. I know in this class we kind of skip presidents, so we went from Teddy Roosevelt to Woodrow Wilson, but that's really what you need to know, and that's what's on the key concept outline for College Board. But Woodrow Wilson, who's the president during World War I, He is a two-term president, so he ran in 1914 and gets reelected. In 1980, or sorry, I believe it was 1912 to 1916, and then 1916 to 1920. And yeah, there's the date right there, 1916. Um, so he runs on this first platform for his first years from 1912 to 1916. When he tries to get reelected, he says he runs on the campaign. He has kept us out of the war. And Khan Academy is going to quickly tell you that less than a month later, after being elected, he actually pushes us, or gets inaugurated. He pushes us into war, right, and supports this war. So just interesting about Woodrow Wilson, about how he's trying to maintain neutrality, but ultimately felt it wasn't. You kind of have to know the personality of this guy, because personality helps you understand maybe why he thought this was a good idea to get in. So he is a progressive, but what's interesting, he's a Southern, he's a Democrat. There are one of the kind of tinges they have on his record is, he actually segregated the armed forces and segregated federal buildings when they were actually desegregated for a long time. So they kind of feel that there were some racist tendencies by him, and racist policies that were put in, and definitely segregist policies, which are obviously based off of race. So that's one thing, but obviously a major thing. But another thing is he's a big intellectual. He was the president of Princeton. And when you read the history, or taught the history as I was taught about Woodrow Wilson, you kind of find that he's a guy that kind of felt there was an opportunity to, and he talks about this, an opportunity for him to remake the world during this World War I, right? And remember that the Europeans thought this was the war to end all wars. And he really begins to articulate this in a document that he calls his 14 points, which is kind of his vision of how to make the world safe for democracy, how to make the world safe for all. And it's a visionary, it's a big plan, and he doesn't get all of it. So you'll learn that in the next video. But Woodrow Wilson, he produces a document called the 14 Points, and he brings these 14 points into the peace negotiations when the armistice is signed. And it's kind of interesting. The Italians, not the Italians, the French had lost, I think, almost half of their males, right? Because all the fighting had really occurred on the Western Front between France and Germany. And so France had devastating losses. Remember, this is an incredibly violent war. This is the first war we start getting machine guns and trench warfare, and we start seeing casualties not in the thousands, but now in the millions. And it's also affecting the civilian population as well. So this total war is just it's devastating to both sides, the Germans and the French and everybody involved. But really, the Germans and the French are the ones that really lose the most during this time. And he comes up with these 14 points, and there's kind of the story of the French ambassador Clemenceau to the peace negotiations, kind of looking around and saying, it's real nice that basically Woodrow Wilson has given us these 14 points. Remember that he only came at the end of the war, and we've been fighting most of the war. So Woodrow Wilson is going to be looked upon very critically by most of the allies, and even the Central Powers, saying, why do you think you little teenager America can come in and dictate the terms of peace and your vision of the world when you guys came at the very end? Now people would say that if it wasn't for America's entrance in the war, most likely maybe the Germans may have won. It really did help out the Allies to maintain a line on that Western Front and make sure the Germans didn't continue rolling. So, at certain levels, America did have a significant input. Now, the amount of deaths aren't there, and the amount of fighting, as most of the fighting was done by the British and French. What we did is we basically brought our troops over to Britain, and Britain could now push their troops out to help out France, right? So it's a little lopsided on that history, but just an interesting thing that he's coming into. He's coming into a place where there's a big hatred towards the Germans by the French and the British, but especially the French. And he's coming in where they've only fought basically 8 months of a 4-year war, and the last 8 months, right? So he's not going to get everything he wants, but you're going to go and learn about his 14 points, and then we are going to talk in our next video about the end of those those 14 points and how they got passed or didn't get passed, and what his vision was. So that's a little introduction, and we'll talk about more of the details of the 14 points in our next video and wrap this war up. All right, guys, we'll see you in the next one. Take care.